2:14 in the morning. The Zagros Mountains of western Iran. The HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk, call sign Jolly 5-1, was already skimming the jagged ridgelines at 80 feet above the ground. The mission was a high-stakes recovery of a downed F-35 pilot, but the electronic environment inside the cockpit was behaving in ways the pre-mission briefing had deemed impossible. Why was the primary navigation display flickering with a rhythmic, pulsing distortion that seemed to match the physical vibration of the aircraft? The thin, freezing mountain air carried the sharp scent of burned JP-8 fuel and the dry alkaline dust of the high Iranian plateau. Below the landing gear, the moonless dark hid limestone peaks that rose like jagged teeth into the flight path, forcing the pilot to rely entirely on his night vision goggles and the terrain-following radar. Major Elias Miller gripped the collective with a gloved hand, his eyes scanning the green-tinted world outside the canopy. In the seat next to him, Captain Sarah Vance was struggling with the communication suite. The United States Air Force's Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment, dated April 8, 2026, had assessed Iranian jamming assets in the western border region as obsolete and incapable of affecting encrypted satellite communications. According to that assessment, Jolly 5-1 should have had a clear, unhackable line to the overhead command and control aircraft. Instead, every time Vance attempted to burst a position report, the screens on the center console bled into a static-filled haze. The interference was not a standard wall of white noise. It was subtle. It was a shifting, oscillating wave that Vance began to recognize as something far more dangerous than simple signal blocking. She watched as the internal diagnostic monitors for the flight control system began to register phantom errors. The digital readout indicated a hydraulic pressure drop in the tail rotor, but the physical feel of the aircraft remained steady. "Miller, I have a ghost pulse," Vance said, her voice tight over the internal intercom. "It is mimicking our internal diagnostic frequencies. The system thinks we have a mechanical failure in the secondary servos, but the actual pressure readings are nominal. Something is feeding a loopback into our own wiring." The ghost pulse was the signature element of an electronic attack the crew had never been trained to encounter. It was a parasitic signal, one that did not just jam the radio, but whispered lies to the helicopter's own computers. It was designed to make a pilot abort a mission based on a perceived mechanical emergency that did not actually exist. Miller felt the airframe shudder as he banked the HH-60 Whiskey into a narrow canyon, the walls rising 500 feet on either side. The ground speed was 120 knots. In the back of the aircraft, 4 pararescuemen checked the seals on their rifles and adjusted their medical kits. They were 20 miles from the beacon of the downed pilot, a distance that should have taken less than 10 minutes to cover. "Ignore the warnings for now," Miller commanded, though his heart hammered against his ribs as a red master caution light illuminated on the Kachin dashboard. "If the blades are still turning and the stick is still moving, we keep pushing." "Vance, try the low-frequency backup. We need to tell command that the intelligence brief was wrong. The Iranians are not using old equipment. They are using something we have never seen before." Vance toggled the switches, her fingers moving with practiced precision despite the vibration of the low-altitude flight. Every time she reached for a dial, the ghost pulse seemed to adapt, shifting its frequency to shadow her movements. The electronic shadow was following them, growing stronger as they moved. Deeper into the mountain range, the canyon narrowed. The limestone walls seemed to press in, the heat from the twin engines reflecting off rock and washing back over the fuselage. The acrid stink of hot metal and hydraulic fluid filled the small cockpit. Miller could see the faint glow of the pilot's survival beacon on his helmet-mounted display, a tiny pulsing dot that represented their entire objective. But between them and that dot lay a wall of invisible energy that was slowly stripping away the aircraft's ability to see itself. 20 miles out, Vance reported, her eyes fixed on the flickering map. But the jamming is intensifying. If this pulse hits the flight computer directly, I cannot guarantee the fly-by-wire system will stay stable. We are flying into a digital blind spot. and we are doing it at 80 feet. Miller did not pull back on the power. He pushed the nose down, hugging the floor of the canyon, the shadow of the Pave Hawk dancing over the rocks in the faint infrared light. They were committed to the rescue, but the shield of American technical superiority had just developed its first terrifying crack. 2:22 in the morning. The aircraft maintained its heading of 085 degrees. The HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk continued its low-altitude ingress, the twin T-700, GE-700, and 1 Charlie engines humming with a rhythmic vibration that felt increasingly off-balance to Miller's touch. The Central Command Intelligence Summary, delivered to the squadron commander at Al Udeid Air Base 48 hours prior, had assessed the Iranian coastal and mountain range jamming capabilities as limited to basic frequency hopping noise, with no ability to penetrate the secure Link 16 data sharing network. This assessment was the foundation of the mission's electronic protection plan. However, the reality displayed on the cockpit's multi-function screens was a direct contradiction of that brief. The Link 16 icon, which should have shown the position of the overhead E3 Sentry airborne warning and control system, was flickering before turning a solid, stagnant gray. The cold mountain air seeped through the canopy seals, carrying the scent of dry pine and the metallic tang of the aircraft's own electronics running at peak capacity. Vance adjusted the gain on her night vision goggles, trying to peer through the digital artifacts crawling across her field of view. The ghost pulse was no longer just an interference pattern. It was starting to generate false targets on the AN/APG-47 radar. Miller, we have 3 separate ground-to-air radar hits appearing on the threat warner, Vance said, her voice steady but rapid. But the bearings are impossible. One is showing directly below us in the canyon floor, and the other 2 are moving at 400 knots through the rock walls. It is the ghost pulse. It is spoofing the radar return by echoing our own signal back to us with a microsecond delay. In the back of the Pave Hawk, Master Sergeant Ben Kessler, the lead pararescue man, leaned forward to the cockpit. He was a veteran of 24 recoveries, his face a map of scars and concentration. He checked the status of the heavy-duty rescue hoist and the litter they would use to pull the F-35 pilot out of the terrain. Status on the survivor? Kessler asked. His beacon is still active at coordinates 34 degrees, 12 minutes north, 46 degrees, 51 minutes east. Miller replied, his hands making minute, constant corrections to the flight controls. But we are losing the signal strength. The interference is localized. It is getting heavier the closer we get to the recovery point. It is as if they are luring us into a funnel. The Pave Hawk banked hard to the left, following a sharp bend in the riverbed that snaked through the valley. The limestone walls were so close that the rotor wash kicked up a storm of grit and small stones that pinged against the armored belly of the helicopter. Miller was flying by instinct now, his primary flight display showing a simulated horizon that was lagging 3 seconds behind the actual movement of the aircraft. The ghost pulse was now affecting the internal intercom. A high-pitched, melodic chirping began to override Miller's headset. It sounded like a bird, but it was purely electronic, a byproduct of the Iranian array's attempt to sync with the helicopter's internal communication bus. The intelligence brief assessed their mountain arrays as non-operational due to lack of spare parts, Vance muttered, more to herself than to Miller. But that signal is coming from a high-output phased array. Someone moved a mobile electronic warfare suite into these mountains within the last 24 hours, and they knew exactly which frequencies we would be using for the rescue. The discrepancy between the mission planning and the current tactical environment was stark. There were no obsolete systems here. The Iranians were utilizing a sophisticated, modern electronic trap. 5 miles to the survivor's last known position, Miller announced. Vance, clear the chaff and flare dispensers. If they can spoof our radar, they can likely guide a missile through the noise. Kessler, get your team on the fast ropes. We are not going to have a stable hover for long if the flight computer keeps fighting the ghost pulse. The acrid stink of ozone intensified in the cockpit. On the center console, a warning light for the transmission oil temperature flashed red. Miller checked the secondary analog gauge. It was steady in the green. The digital system was lying again. The Ghost Pulse was attempting to force a software-controlled engine shutdown by simulating a catastrophic thermal event. Miller reached out and flipped the digital engine control to manual override. He was taking the computer out of the loop, trusting his own senses over the billions of dollars of flight software that was currently being dissected by an unseen enemy. The Pave Hawk surged forward, the engines roaring with a raw, unrefined power as the pilot took full command of the machine. "I have visual on the survivor's strobe," Miller said, his eyes locking onto a tiny, rhythmic flash of infrared light on a ledge 300 feet above the canyon floor. "But I also have 3 separate heat signatures on the ridgeline above him. They aren't fires. Those are engine exhausts." The rescue was no longer a simple extraction. It was an intercept. 2:27 in the morning. The canyon floor widened into a high-altitude bowl surrounded by jagged peaks. Jolly 5-1 was now flying at a speed of 85 knots, the low velocity required for the pilot to navigate the tightening terrain. The Ghost Pulse had transitioned from a digital flickering on the screens to a physical vibration that resonated through the cyclic stick in Miller's right hand. It was a rhythmic, hammering sensation, as if the flight control servos were fighting against an invisible tether. The flight computer, bombarded by the parasitic IRANIAN signal, was attempting to compensate for movements that Miller was not actually making. The air inside the cockpit was heavy with the scent of ozone and the dry, biting cold of the Zagros peaks. Every time the pulse hit its peak frequency, the HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk would lurch 3 degrees to the left, forcing Miller to use significant physical strength to keep the nose on the horizon. The fly-by-wire system, designed to make the aircraft the most stable rescue platform in the world, was being turned into a weapon against its own crew. "Is reaching 80% saturation," Vance reported, her voice strained as she watched the data streams. The Ghost Pulse is injecting a corrective command every 12 milliseconds. The aircraft thinks it is in a permanent state of atmospheric turbulence. If we don't bypass the primary flight computer, the servos are going to burn out from the friction. The Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment had specifically stated that Iranian forces lacked the signal processing speed to interact with American fly-by-wire protocols in real time. That assessment was being dismantled with every shudder of the airframe. The Iranians were not just jamming the signal, they were participating in the flight of the aircraft from a distance of 15 miles. Miller adjusted the collective, feeling the resistance of the heavy machine. Switching to degraded flight mode 3. "I am taking the computer out of the loop entirely. We are going to manual backup." He reached up and flipped a series of guarded switches on the overhead panel. The flickering multifunction displays went dark, replaced by the dim, steady glow of the analog standby instruments. The hammering in the stick stopped instantly, but the aircraft suddenly felt twice as heavy. Without the computer-assisted stability, the Pave Hawk was a beast of momentum and gravity, requiring constant, aggressive input to stay level in the thin mountain air. Below them, the terrain was a blur of gray stone and deep black shadows. The survivor's beacon was now less than 2 miles away, located on a narrow limestone shelf that jutted out from the eastern wall of the bowl. "I have the survivor," Miller said, his breath hitching as he wrestled the aircraft into a descending turn. "And I have the heat signatures again. They are moving along the ridgeline at 30 miles per hour. Those are Russian-made BTR-80 armored personnel carriers. They are headed for the pilot's position." The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than the electronic one. The Iranian ground forces were using the Ghost Pulse as a digital screen, moving their assets into position, while the American crew was distracted by the simulated mechanical failures. The intelligence failure was now a physical threat. The Iranian commanders had predicted exactly how the American pilots would react to the interference, and they had timed their ground assault to coincide with the moment of maximum technical confusion. "Kessler, we are going to have to do this fast." Miller transmitted to the back of the helicopter. "The enemy is on the ridge. We have 3 minutes before they have a direct line of sight on the survivor. We are going to hover taxi to the shelf, drop the pararescue men, and I will stay in a low-profile hover until you have the pilot secured." The Pave Hawk tilted forward, its nose dipping as Miller pushed the manual controls to the limit. The sound of the rotor blades changed, shifting from a steady hum to a deep, aggressive slap as they bit into the thin air. The acrid smell of hot hydraulic fluid grew stronger. Miller ignored the warnings, his eyes fixed on the small, flickering strobe of the downed pilot, who was now visible as a dark shape, waving his arms against the pale limestone. The digital shield was gone. The technical advantage was gone. All that remained was 20,000 pounds of metal, 4 pararescue men, and a pilot who refused to let the mountains claim another life. 2:31 in the morning. 100 feet above the jagged limestone shelf, the HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk began its final transition to a stationary hover, the ground speed bleeding away from 30 knots down to a dead crawl. Below, the downed F-35 pilot was a stark, desperate silhouette against the pale, wind-swept rock. He was crouched in the shadow of a boulder, his infrared strobe light pulsing like a rhythmic heartbeat in the green glow of Miller's night vision goggles. The air was a chaotic swirl of limestone dust and the biting scent of cold mineral earth, kicked up by the massive downwash of the rotor blades. On the ridgeline 500 yards above them, the 3 BTR-80 armored vehicles did not slow down or wait for their crews to dismount as the previous intelligence brief had predicted they would. The United States Air Force's Central Command assessment had stated that Iranian mobile ground units in this sector lacked integrated fire control systems and would require manual voice coordination to engage an aerial target. The pros of that assessment was proven wrong in the span of 3 seconds. The BTR-80 vehicles pivoted their 14.5mm heavy machine guns in perfect mechanical synchronization. They were not being aimed by human gunners looking through optical sights. They were slave to the same ghost pulse signal that was currently dissecting the helicopter's internal systems. The Iranian ground units were part of the same digital web that was jamming the American radio channels. Miller saw the muzzle flashes on the ridge. They were not the erratic orange sprays of a local militia. They were the concentrated, computerized bursts of a networked air defense system. The tracers did not search the sky. They converged into a single, high-velocity stream of lead directed with mathematical precision at the Pave Hawk's main rotor hub. "Flares! Vance, dump the flares!" Miller shouted over the intercom, the manual flight controls vibrating so violently in his hands that his forearms began to cramp. Vance slammed her hand onto the countermeasure release button, but the magnesium flares remained locked in their dispensers. On the auxiliary display, a line of code appeared that Vance had never seen in a flight manual. The Ghost Pulse had migrated from the flight computer into the weapon management bus. It was sending a continuous, high-priority safe command to the firing pins of the flare buckets, effectively tricking the aircraft into believing it was still parked on the tarmac at Al Udeid. The intelligence assessment that had labeled Iranian jamming as obsolete was now a lethal fiction. The adversary was not just blocking the signal. They had full, read-write access to the Pave Hawk's defensive protocols. "The bus is locked!" Vance screamed, her fingers flying across the backup keypad. "I can't break the override!" The stream of 14.5mm rounds tore through the air, the sound of the heavy projectiles passing the canopy like the snapping of a whip. The pilot on the ground dived for cover as the limestone shelf around him erupted in a storm of rock shards and white dust. Miller was forced to bank the unassisted 20,000-pound aircraft away from the shelf. Without the stability of the flight computer, the helicopter wallowed in the thin air, the rotors screaming as they bit into the atmosphere. In the back of the aircraft, Master Sergeant Kessler grabbed the edge of the open door, his boots skidding on the metal floor. As the helicopter tilted at a 30-degree angle, the acrid stink of hot hydraulic fluid and burnt gunpowder filled the cabin. He looked down at the survivor, who was being swallowed by the dust and the tracers. "We are losing the window!" Kessler yelled. Miller did not answer. He was pouring every ounce of his physical strength into the cyclic, fighting the aerodynamic torque that wanted to flip the helicopter into the canyon wall. The Ghost Pulse was now generating a false terrain warning in his headset, a deafening, synthesized voice, screaming, "Pull up," even though there was nothing but empty air beneath them. The Iranian ground forces had not just predicted the rescue, they had engineered a technical environment where the American aircraft's own safety systems were being used to force a crash. The intelligence gap was no longer a matter of debate. It was a physical wall of lead and light that was pushing Jolly 5-1 toward the breaking point. 2:35 in the morning. The high-altitude bowl was a vortex of noise and kinetic energy. Major Miller hauled the HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk back into a low-profile approach, the airframe screaming as he forced the 20,000-pound machine into a tight, descending spiral. The limestone walls of the canyon were a blur of pale gray in his night vision goggles. The previous intelligence assessment from the United States Air Force Central Command had stated that the terrain at coordinates 34 degrees 12 minutes north, 46 degrees 51 minutes east would provide a natural acoustic and electronic shield for the recovery. That assessment was effectively dead. The ghost pulse was bouncing off the canyon walls, creating a multi-path interference environment that made the cockpit feel like it was trapped inside a microwave. "I am bringing her back in," Miller shouted, his voice straining against the physical load of the manual flight controls. "Vance, find me a window through that jamming. If I can't get a stable hover for 30 seconds, the pararescue men are going to be swinging on the ropes like a pendulum." Captain Vance was no longer looking at the primary displays. She had pulled a ruggedized tablet from her flight suit, hardwiring it directly into the helicopter's secondary sensor bus to bypass the infected main computer. Her eyes scanned the raw data streams, looking for the source of the ghost pulse. "Miller, the signal is not coming from the BTR-80s, Vance yelled back. "The vehicles are just relay nodes. The primary transmitter is located in a cave opening, 200 meters above the ledge, bearing 045. It is a mobile electronic warfare suite, likely a Russian-made Avtabeza M variant that was never reported in this sector." The presence of such a sophisticated system explained the failure of the satellite link and the lock on the flare dispensers. The Iranians had not just gotten lucky. They had set an electronic ambush that the pre-mission satellite imagery had failed to detect. The intelligence failure was absolute. The Pave Hawk slowed to a crawl, the nose pitching up as Miller used the backup analog gauges to judge his height above the limestone shelf. The downwash from the four-bladed rotor system hit the ledge with the force of a hurricane, sending a thick wall of white dust and debris into the air. The survivor, the downed F-35 pilot, was now less than 50 feet below the cabin door. He was hunkered down, clutching his survival radio, his eyes fixed on the dark shape of the rescue helicopter hovering in the storm of its own making. The smell of burned propellant from the 14.5mm rounds, fired by the BTR-80s, hung heavy in the air, mixed with the acrid stink of the helicopter's overstressed transmission. The heat from the twin engines was trapped in the bowl, shimmering in the infrared spectrum. "Kessler, you are clear to deploy," Miller commanded. "Go, go, go!" In the back of the aircraft, Master Sergeant Kessler and his three-man pararescue team stepped to the edge of the cabin. They did not use the rescue hoist. There was no time for the slow mechanical winch. They kicked two heavy fast ropes out of the door. The thick, braided nylon snakes fell through the dust, slapping against the limestone shelf with a heavy thud. Kessler was the first man out. He gripped the rope with his gloved hands and boots, sliding down the 30-foot drop in less than 2 seconds. He hit the ground in a tactical crouch, his rifle already raised and scanning the ridgeline where the Iranian armored vehicles were repositioning for a second volley. The transition to the hover was the most dangerous phase of the mission. At this altitude and temperature, the HH-60 Whiskey was operating at the very edge of its power margin. Miller had to keep the engines at 98% torque just to stay airborne. Any sudden movement, any gust of wind, or any further interference from the ghost pulse could send the aircraft into a catastrophic power settling. "Ropes are clear." "Second man down," Vance reported, her eyes darting between the tablet and the dark horizon. "Miller, the Avtabeza M is shifting frequencies. It is looking for our engine control units now. It is trying to spoof the fuel flow sensors." Miller clamped his jaw shut, his knuckles white on the cyclic. He could feel the aircraft trying to die beneath him. the electronic ghost was reaching for the very heart of the machine, trying to trick the engines into thinking they were overheating so the automatic safety systems would shut them down in midair. "I have the pilot!" Kessler's voice crackled through the interference. "He is wounded. Shrapnel in the left leg. We are prepping the litter. Hold this position for 60 seconds." 60 seconds felt like an eternity. Above them, the BTR-80 on the center ridge began to move again, its heavy machine gun turret slewing toward the hovering helicopter. The ghost pulse intensified, the melodic chirping in Miller's headset turning into a deafening, rhythmic scream. The rescue was in the balance. The American crew was fighting a battle on two fronts: the physical world of lead and rock, and the digital world where their own aircraft was being turned into a traitor. 2:39 in the morning, the limestone bowl erupted in a crossfire of kinetic energy. The right side door gunner, Staff Sergeant Roy, was already leaning his entire body weight into the spade grips of the M13-4 minigun before the first Iranian tracer even cleared the ridgeline. He felt the weapon vibrate through his chest as the barrels spun to life, spitting a continuous stream of 3,000 rounds per minute that tore into the limestone where the BTR-80 was attempting to range its turret. High on the ridge, an Iranian soldier depressed, the firing stud on a Dehlavi anti-tank guided missile tube. The missile erupted from its canister with a sharp, pneumatic crack, followed by the deafening roar of the rocket motor, carving a spiraling trail of gray smoke through the dark as it corrected for the Pave Hawk's heat signature. The shaped charge warhead slammed into the edge of the limestone shelf 6 feet below the cockpit, the impact punching a jagged hole through the rock and sending a cloud of supersonic stone fragments upward into the belly of the helicopter. The blast tore through the hydraulic lines of the forward landing gear, the metal groaning as the struts sheared away, and fell into the canyon below. Inside the cockpit, the shockwave threw Captain Vance against the side window, her helmet cracking against the glass, while Miller's boots were kicked off the pedals by the buckled floorboards. The heat blast washed across the flight deck, smelling of sulfur and vaporized fluid. The immediate air was a thick, blinding haze of white dust. The only sound the high-pitched whistle of the turbine, engines fighting to maintain the hover, as the helicopter lurched violently to the left. Miller's hands were a blur of motion as he fought to stabilize the HH-60 whiskey. The ghost pulse was screaming in his ears, a chaotic wall of digital noise that made the manual flight controls feel like they were submerged in thick, viscous oil. The United States Air Force's Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment had stated that Iranian mobile units lacked the coordination for simultaneous electronic and kinetic strikes, but the timing of the missile launch with the peak of the jamming signal was flawless. The assessment had been a dangerous miscalculation of the adversary's networked capability. "Roy, keep that minigun talking," Miller shouted, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline. "Vance, I need a status on the utility bus, now!" Vance shook her head, blinking back. The blur in her vision as blood, from a small cut on her forehead, began to seep into her goggles. She gripped her tablet, which was now the only functioning diagnostic tool in the cockpit. "Engine 2 is fluctuating. We have a massive hydraulic leak in the secondary utility bus. The forward landing gear is gone, and the rescue hoist is losing pressure. Miller, we cannot sustain this hover for more than another 40 seconds before the pump runs dry." On the ground, Master Sergeant Kessler was shielding the wounded F-35 pilot, with his own body as debris from the explosion rained down on them. The limestone shelf was covered in white powder and jagged shards of metal. The pararescuemen were struggling to secure the pilot into the litter, their movements hampered by the intense downwash and constant spray of 14.5mm rounds hitting the rock faces around them. The sudden lurch of the aircraft had sent rescue ropes swinging wildly over the edge of the cliff, nearly pulling one of the team members with it. The acrid stink of burning insulation filled the cabin as the ghost pulse surged again, short-circuiting the internal lighting of the Pave Hawk. The cockpit was plunged into a strobe-like darkness illuminated only by the rhythmic orange flashes of the door gunner's fire and the pale, cold moonlight reflecting off the canyon walls. "Kessler, we are losing the airframe," Miller transmitted, his voice cracking. "Load him now, or we are leaving you behind." Kessler didn't respond with words. He gave a sharp, downward signal to his team. They abandoned the standard winch procedure. Two pararescuemen grabbed the handles of the litter, while Kessler and the fourth man grabbed the fast ropes. They began a desperate, manual haul using their own body weight and strength to pull the wounded pilot up toward the door of the lurching helicopter. Above them, the second BTR-80 on the ridge began to move. Its tires kicked up plumes of dust as it accelerated toward a new firing position that would give it a direct shot into the open cabin door. The ghost pulse intensified, shifting its frequency again, this time targeting the fuel control units of the twin T700 engines. Miller felt the power drop. The rotor speed decayed by 5%, the deep thrum of the blades turning into a labored, heavy groaning. "They are choking the engines," Vance yelled, her fingers flying across the tablet as she tried to inject a counter code into the engine control bus. "Miller, I am losing the override. The Avtabaza M is mimicking the shutdown sequence." The helicopter began to settle, sinking toward the jagged rocks of the shelf. Miller pulled the collective to his chest, the muscles in, his back screaming under the strain. He was demanding more power than the engines were allowed to give, overriding the thermal limiters with a manual bypass. The exhaust temperature gauges on the analog panel climbed into the red, the smell of scorching metal filling the air as the turbines pushed past their design limits. "Got him! He's in!" Roy's voice came over the intercom, punctuated by the final, deafening burst of his minigun as the weapon ran dry. The pararescuemen tumbled into the cabin, dragging the litter and the wounded pilot over the threshold just as the Pave Hawk's belly scraped against the limestone. Miller didn't wait for them to strap in. He shoved the cyclic forward and dumped the collective, trading altitude for airspeed in a desperate, falling turn away from the ridge. As they dived into the darkness of the lower canyon, a second missile streaked overhead, missing the rotor hub by less than 10 feet. The heat of its passage was felt through the canopy, a fleeting, terrifying reminder of the intelligence gap that had nearly turned the mission into a massacre. They were away from the shelf, but the aircraft was bleeding hydraulic fluid, and the ghost pulse was still reaching out through the dark, trying to finish what the missiles had started. 2:44 in the morning. The HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk was running heavy and low, nose down at an angle of 10 degrees, to maintain 60 knots of airspeed. The primary hydraulic system pressure was hovering at 400 pounds per square inch, less than 1/7 of its operational capacity. The red fluid, MILH 5606, was spraying from the severed lines in the forward wheel well, coating the underside of the fuselage in a slick, crimson film that shimmered in the infrared light of the chase cameras. Every time Miller moved the cyclic, the aircraft groaned, a deep, metallic protest that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of his boots. In the back of the cabin, the environment was a chaotic mix of emergency medicine and battlefield triage. The smell of copper-rich blood and antiseptic wipes fought against the pervasive stink of burned jet fuel. Master Sergeant Kessler had his knee pinned against the floor to stabilize himself as the helicopter bucked in the turbulent mountain air. He was working on the downed pilot, Captain Reed, whose left leg had been shredded by the limestone fragments kicked up by the Iranian missile strike. "I need a tourniquet on the left femoral artery," Kessler shouted over the roar of the wind, screaming through the open cabin doors. "And get the oxygen mask on him. His saturation is dropping. The shock is setting in." The pararescuemen moved with a fluid, practiced efficiency, their hands steady even as the aircraft lurched under the influence of the ghost pulse. They were not just fighting for the pilot's life, they were fighting the physics of a dying airframe. The United States Air Force Central Command Medical Assessment for the mission had predicted that any casualties would be evacuated to a stable, pressurized cabin within 15 minutes of recovery. That assessment was another casualty of the night. With the hydraulic system failing and the ghost pulse still hammering the flight, computer Jolly 5-1 could not climb above the ridgelines to reach the smoother air. They were trapped in the low-altitude rotor wash of the canyon floors. On the flight deck, Miller's forearms were shaking from the sheer physical effort of holding the manual controls. Without the hydraulic boost, the stick required 40 pounds of pressure just to maintain a level bank. He could feel the ghost pulse attempting to re-establish its handshake with the engine control units. The rhythmic, bird-like chirping in his headset had returned, but it was lower now, more insistent. "Vance, how much fluid do we have left in the utility reservoir?" Miller asked, his voice tight, with strain. Captain Vance was leaning forward, her eyes glued to the analog pressure gauge. "We are down to 10%. When that hits zero, the tail rotor pitch becomes fixed. We will lose the ability to yaw. If that happens in these narrows, we are going to spin into the rock." The intelligence failure that had placed the Avtabaza M electronic warfare suite in these mountains continued to haunt their egress. The Iranian radar was no longer painting them with a traditional search beam. They were being tracked by the ghost pulse itself. The parasitic signal was acting as a beacon, allowing the Iranian ground units to follow the Pave Hawk's exact path through the mountains by monitoring the distortion in the helicopter's own internal data bus. The previous intelligence brief had stated that Iranian signals intelligence was unable to track low probability of intercept transmissions. But the ghost pulse was not a transmission, it was a reflection. The Iranians were using the Pave Hawk's own electronics against it, turning the most advanced rescue helicopter in the world into a glowing infrared target. 5 miles to the border, Miller announced, though the border was just a line on a map that offered no physical protection. The transmission oil temperature is climbing. 130 degrees. 140. If the gearbox seizes, we are a lawn dart. The acrid smell of hot oil began to permeate the cockpit, a thick, greasy scent that coated the back of Miller's throat. He reduced the power slightly, trying to nurse the overstressed turbines, but the Pave Hawk began to sink. The limestone floor of the canyon rose up to meet them, the jagged rocks appearing as pale ghosts in the night vision. "Goggles! Hold on back there!" Miller yelled. He pulled the nose up at the last second. The belly of the helicopter clearing, a limestone spur by less than 5 feet. The sound of the wind changed, a hollow, booming resonance as they passed through a narrow gap in the stone. They were still flying, but the margin for error had vanished. The ghost pulse surged one. Last time, a deafening screech in the headsets, and then the primary navigation screen went completely black. They were flying on instinct, blood, and a failing hydraulic pump, deep inside a country that had proven every American intelligence prediction wrong. 2:50 in the morning, the jagged border between Iran and Turkey. The HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk was no longer the sleek, digitally integrated rescue platform that had departed from the staging base hours earlier. It was a vibrating mass of stressed titanium and leaking fluids, flying at a heading of 040 degrees toward the relative safety of NATO-controlled airspace. The ghost pulse, which the pre-mission satellite imagery and intelligence briefings had assessed as a localized, ground-based interference limited to the immediate recovery zone, was proving to be far more persistent. As Jolly 5-1 crossed the final mountain pass before the border, the interference did not fade. It expanded. The acrid scent of scorched hydraulic fluid and the sharp chemical tang of burning electrical insulation filled the cockpit. Major Miller's hands were clamped onto the cyclic and collective with a grip so tight that his muscles began to spasm. The hydraulic pressure in the utility system had officially reached zero. The physical sensation was immediate and terrifying. The pedals, which controlled the tail rotor pitch and the aircraft's yaw, went completely slack. The helicopter began a slow, rhythmic oscillation to the right, a movement Miller could only counter by tilting the entire 20,000-pound airframe to the left. "Vance, the tail rotor is fixed pitch," Miller shouted, his voice a rasp of pure physical exertion. "I have no yaw control." If I drop the airspeed below 40 knots, we are going to start a flat spin that I cannot stop." Captain Vance was leaning into the footwell, using a flashlight to inspect the damage to the cockpit floorboards. The missile strike from the limestone shelf had done more than just destroy the landing gear. A jagged piece of the rock shelf, accelerated to supersonic speeds by the blast, had punched through the avionics bay and severed the fiber optic cable for the number 2 flight control computer. "The Ghost Pulse is feeding directly into the secondary bus through the severed line," Vance reported, her voice rising over the roar of the wind. "It is not just jamming us anymore, Miller. It is using the broken cable as an antenna. The Avtabeza M system back in the canyon is still talking to our internal sensors. It is telling the engines that we are at an altitude of 12,000 feet. The fuel control units are leaning out the mixture for thin air." The United States Air Force Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment had stated that the Iranian signal could not survive the line-of-sight transition over the ridgelines. This assessment was proven false, as the parasitic signal continued to ride the helicopter's own wiring like a virus. The Ghost Pulse was a digital parasite that refused to let go, even as the distance between the aircraft and the transmitter increased to 30 miles. In the back of the cabin, the situation was grimmer. Master Sergeant Kessler had used 2 tactical tourniquets on Captain Reed's leg, but the blood loss was significant. The floor of the Pave Hawk was a skating rink of crimson fluid, a mix of hydraulic oil and human blood. The para-rescue men were huddled around the wounded pilot, using their own bodies to shield him from the freezing air blasting through the open doors. "We are 3 minutes from the border," Vance yelled, her eyes locked on the ruggedized tablet. "But I have 2 heat signatures coming up from the valley floor. Iranian interceptors. They must have been loitering in the radar shadows." The intelligence brief had assessed Iranian air response times in this sector as 45 minutes or greater, citing a lack of night-capable pilots. The 2 streaks of light rising from the valley floor contradicted this, moving with a speed and aggression that suggested they had been cued by the same networked system that had managed the Ghost Pulse. "I can't dogfight this pig, Vance," Miller growled, his face beaded with sweat, despite the sub-zero temperature. "I can barely keep her level. If they get a lock, we are done. We have no flares, no computer, and no landing gear." The acrid stink of the overstressed T-700 engines grew stronger as Miller pushed the collective, demanding every ounce of torque. The machine had left to give. The HH-60 Whiskey surged forward, its nose dipping, the rotor blades slapping the air with a desperate, heavy thrum. The Ghost Pulse intensified, a final, high-pitched scream in the headsets that caused both pilots to wince in pain. They were less than 2 miles from the border. The Iranian interceptors were closing the gap, their radar tracking symbols finally appearing on the backup tablet as 2 aggressive red diamonds. The technical gap between what the US military had expected and what they were facing had become a life-and-death struggle. In the final seconds of the mission, Miller didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the digital horizon of his night vision goggles, aiming for the invisible line in the sky that separated the nightmare of the Zagros Mountains from the hope of the Turkish border. The aircraft groaned, a sound of metal reaching its breaking point as they crossed the threshold. 2:55 in the morning, Turkish airspace, 3 miles west of the border. The 2 red diamonds on the backup tablet, representing the Iranian interceptors, finally banked away, their radar signatures fading as they turned back toward the interior of the Zagros Mountains. They had shadowed the crippled helicopter to the very edge of the sovereign line, a final act of digital intimidation before disengaging. A final act of digital intimidation before disengaging. For the crew of Jolly 5-1, the relief was short-lived. The aircraft was now a vibrating mass of compromised systems and screaming metal. Major Miller was forced to maintain a constant airspeed of 75 knots to keep the HH-60 Whiskey from entering an unrecoverable yaw. Without the ability to change the pitch of the tail rotor blades, the helicopter wanted to spin like a top, a fate Miller was preventing only by keeping the nose dipped and the air flowing over the vertical stabilizer. The freezing mountain wind howled through the cabin, carrying the metallic tang of the aircraft's own blood, the red hydraulic fluid that continued to mist from the severed lines. The floor was a treacherous slick of oil and grit. Captain Vance leaned over the center console, her hands trembling as she attempted to manually reset the communication breakers. The ghost pulse was still there, though it had weakened as they gained distance from the Iranian cave site. It had left the digital architecture of the Pave Hawk in a state of total disorder. The primary flight displays remained dark, and the mission computer was stuck in a reboot loop that flashed the squadron insignia over and over, a mocking reminder of the technology that had failed them. "Radio is still dead," Vance reported, her voice flat with exhaustion. "The pulse has fried the antenna coupling. We are flying in absolute silence. No one at the staging. Base knows we have the survivor. No one knows we are coming in heavy with a wounded pilot, and no landing gear." The silence was the most oppressive part of the egress. The previous intelligence assessment from United States Air Force Central Command had stated that the HH-60 Whiskey's secure communications suite was shielded against all known regional interference patterns. This assessment was now a hollow memory. The silence meant they could not call for the emergency medical teams or the crash fire rescue crews that should have been waiting for them at the forward operating base. They were a ghost ship, flying through the dark on a heading of 300 degrees. In the back, Master Sergeant Kessler had finally stabilized Captain Reed's leg. The para-rescueman sat on the blood-slicked floor, his back against the bulkhead, watching the dark Turkish valleys pass beneath the door. He didn't look like a victor. He looked like a man who had just seen the future of warfare and found it terrifying. The acrid stink of the overstressed engines was joined by the smell of scorched plastic as a secondary wiring. Harness in the ceiling began to smolder. The ghost pulse had triggered a series of electrical surges that were slowly cooking the aircraft from the inside out. "Miller, the engine oil pressure on the number 2 turbine is dropping into the amber," Vance noted, her eyes fixed on the analog standby gauge. 100 pounds per square inch. 95. The limestone shrapnel must have nicked the oil cooler. Miller nodded, his eyes fixed on the placiding, jagged horizon of the Turkish peaks. He did not pull back the power. He couldn't, if he slowed down. To save the engine, the aircraft would lose the aerodynamic stability it needed to stay level. He was trading the life of the engine for the stability of the airframe, a calculated risk that would have been unnecessary if the pre-mission intelligence had correctly identified the Iranian threat. The weight of the moment began to shift from tactical survival to a deeper, more somber realization. The technical shield they had relied on for decades had not just cracked. It had been shattered by an adversary that U.S. intelligence had assessed as incapable. The Pave Hawk groaned as it banked around a limestone cliff, the airframe twisting under the uneven torque. Every bolt and seam in the airframe seemed to be protesting the flight. The physical damage was extensive. The forward landing gear strut was gone, the utility hydraulic system was dry, and the fiber optic flight control bus was severed. Miller could feel the aircraft dying beneath his hands, a slow, agonizing descent into mechanical failure that mirrored the collapsing certainty of mission success. They were alive, and they had the survivor, but the cost of the intelligence failure was already being tallied in the scorched metal and the silent radios of Jolly 5-1. 3:15 in the morning. The floodlights of the forward operating base in eastern Turkey cut through the high-altitude haze like pillars of cold, white fire. Major Miller squinted through the salt-streaked canopy, his eyes burning from the acrid smoke still curling from the electrical panel. Below them, the runway was a narrow strip of sanctuary carved into the dark earth, without radio, communications, or a functioning transponder. Jolly 5-1 was an unidentified shadow approaching a high-readiness NATO installation. The United States Air Force's Central Command Intelligence Assessment had promised that the HH-60 Whiskey would remain a visible and integrated part of the tactical picture at all times. That assessment was a ghost, left behind in the canyons of the Zagros. Miller didn't hesitate. He reached for the manual light switch, and flashed the landing lights in a rhythmic, desperate pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. It was an ancient code for a modern catastrophe. He repeated the signal, banking the heavy, lurching aircraft to show the jagged, empty space where the forward landing gear should have been. The response was immediate. The searchlights on the perimeter swung upward, bathing the scarred fuselage of the Pave Hawk in a blinding glare. On the tarmac, the red and blue lights of the crash fire rescue trucks began to move, racing toward the primary runway. The base had recognized the silhouette of a wounded bird returning from the dark. The landing was not a maneuver. It was a physical confrontation between gravity and a dying machine. Because the tail rotor was fixed and the forward gear was missing, Miller could not perform a standard vertical touchdown. He had to fly the 20,000-pound aircraft onto the runway like a fixed-wing jet, maintaining enough forward airspeed to keep the nose from spinning. The cold Turkish air rushed past the open cabin doors as Miller leveled the helicopter at 10 feet. Brace! Brace in the back! The belly of the HH-60 Whiskey slammed into the concrete at 55 knots. The sound was not an explosion, but a sustained, deafening shriek of titanium grinding against stone. A massive plume of orange sparks erupted from beneath the cockpit, illuminating the night like a Roman candle. The helicopter skidded, the armor plating on the underside tearing away in jagged strips as it fought the friction of the runway. The pull time, physical shock of the impact threw Miller forward against his shoulder harnesses, the breath leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. The smell of burning metal and vaporized fire suppressant foam filled the cabin. The aircraft tilted forward, the nose digging into the concrete until the remaining rear wheels lifted off the ground, then slammed back down. As the momentum finally bled away, Jolly, 5-1, came to a halt 300 yards from the approach end of the strip. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling turbine blades and the distant, rhythmic wail of the approaching ambulances. The ghost pulse was gone. The Iranian interceptors were gone, but as the ground crews swarmed the aircraft, their foam cannons drenching the scorched fuselage in white chemical snow, the true weight of the mission began to settle over the crew. Medical teams in reflective vests reached the cabin door first, dragging the litter, carrying Captain Reed out into the light. The pararescue men followed, their uniforms soaked in a dark mixture of hydraulic fluid and blood. Miller sat in his seat, his hands still clamped onto the cyclic, watching the frenzied activity through the cracked glass of the canopy. He looked at the severed fiber optic cables and the ruined avionics bay. The mission was over. The pilot was home. But the technical supremacy that had defined Miller's entire career felt like it had been left in the dirt of the foreign military plateau, dismantled by a pulse of light and a failure of imagination. 3:25 in the morning. The forward operating base was a landscape of harsh shadows and the clinical, blue-white glare of emergency floodlights. The HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk sat at a skewed angle on the runway, its belly resting directly on the concrete, where the forward landing gear had once been. The fire suppressant foam was beginning to settle, forming a thick, white crust over the scorched fuselage that looked like a premature burial. Technical crews from the maintenance squadron stood in a wide circle, their faces illuminated by the strobing lights of the ambulances. They were silent, looking at the jagged holes in the tail boom and the shredded remnants of the avionics bay where the ghost pulse had done its silent, invisible work. The transition from the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the cockpit to the sterile quiet of the base was jarring. Major Miller stood 50 feet away from his aircraft, a silver thermal blanket draped over his flight suit. His hands were finally still, though the muscles in his forearms felt like they had been replaced by hot lead. He watched as the medical team loaded Captain Vance into a separate transport. She was conscious, but the concussion from the missile strike and the shrapnel that had pierced the cockpit glass had left her pale and unresponsive. The flight surgeon had already noted the names of the injured. Captain Vance, for a grade 3 concussion and multiple lacerations, and Staff Sergeant Roy for a ruptured eardrum and severe thermal burns on his right arm from the overheating minigun barrels. The air in Turkey was cold and tasted of the high mountains, but it lacked the electric tension of the Zagros. There was no melodic chirping in his headset now, only the distant, rhythmic hum of the base's power generators. A colonel from the Wing Intelligence Office approached Miller, a digital recorder already in his hand. The debriefing would be long, but the primary conclusion was already written in the wreckage on the runway. The United States Air Force's Central Command Electronic Warfare Assessment, the document they had trusted with their lives, was now a pile of irrelevant paper. It had failed to predict the Avtobaza M system. It had failed to understand the ghost pulse. And it had failed to account for an adversary that was no longer interested in simply jamming a signal, but in rewriting the reality of a fly-by-wire cockpit. Miller looked at the colonel, his eyes red from the smoke and the long hours of night vision strain. The philosophical weight of the night began to settle on him. A realization that went beyond the immediate survival of his crew. The technical shield of the United States Air Force had been designed with the assumption of total digital dominance, an assumption that the Iranian technicians in a cave in the Zagros had dismantled in less than an hour. They had not just fought a helicopter, they had hacked a philosophy of war. The intelligence brief said, "They couldn't touch us," Miller said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the wind. They said their gear was obsolete, but they weren't just listening to us, Colonel. They were inside the flight bus. They were telling the aircraft how to fly. We didn't win because of our technology. We won because we finally had the sense to turn it off. The colonel didn't answer. He simply looked at the Pave Hawk, his expression unreadable. The aircraft, which represented tens of millions of dollars in advanced engineering, was now a total loss, a Category 5 airframe that would never fly again. The fiber optic flight control bus was not just severed, it was fused, the delicate glass strands melted, by the electrical surges of the ghost pulse. The number 2 engine was a ruin of heat-distorted blades and scorched oil lines. The cost of the recovery of one pilot was the permanent destruction of a frontline rescue asset, and the physical and mental scarring of its crew. As Miller watched the maintenance team prepare the heavy-duty tow truck to drag the carcass of Jolly 5-1 off the active runway, he realized that the mission's success was a thin, fragile thing. The shadow of the Zagros Mountains felt longer now, stretching across the border and into the very heart of the base, a reminder that the next time they crossed that line, the ghost pulse would be waiting, and the manual backup might not be enough. 5:45 in the morning. The sun rose over the jagged peaks of eastern Turkey, casting long, pale shadows across the runway, where the recovery mission had finally ended. The HH-60 Whiskey Pave Hawk was no longer a machine of war. Towed into the far corner of a maintenance hangar, it sat propped up on heavy wooden blocks, its belly scarred, and its internal wiring exposed like the nerves of a dissected animal. The technical assessment team, flown in from Ramstein Air Base, moved around the airframe with the quiet, somber intensity of forensic investigators. They were not looking for ways to fix the helicopter. They were trying to understand how the United States Air Force's Central Command intelligence brief had been so catastrophically wrong. The cost of the recovery was not a list of tactical objectives achieved. It was a ledger of permanent physical losses. Captain Reed, the F-35 pilot whose life had been the focus of the night, was currently in a stabilization ward 3 miles away. The 14.5mm rounds and the limestone shrapnel had done too much damage. The surgeons had been forced to amputate his left leg below the knee. Captain Sarah Vance sat in the hallway of the base clinic, her right hand wrapped in a thick pressure bandage, to address the nerve damage caused by the cockpit's electrical surge. The doctors could not yet say if she would ever regain the fine motor control required to fly a combat aircraft again. Staff Sergeant Roy, the door gunner, was being fitted for a hearing aid to compensate for the permanent rupture of his eardrum, a direct result of the acoustic pressure of the missile blast inside the bowl. Inside the hangar, The lead technician pulled a handful of fused fiber optic cables from the avionics bay. These strands of glass, designed to carry the split-second commands of the fly-by-wire system, were now a single, blackened lump of melted plastic. The ghost pulse had not just jammed the signal, it had physically overloaded the bus, sending a surge of high-frequency energy through the aircraft's nervous system. The technical shield, assessed as impenetrable 48 hours prior, had become a conduit for the helicopter's own destruction. The ghost pulse had changed the fundamental math of the region. The foreign military had demonstrated that the most advanced rescue platform in the military inventory could be blinded and turned against itself by a mobile array that intelligence had assessed as non-operational. The mission had succeeded in bringing the pilot home, but it had left a billion-dollar tactical advantage in the dirt of the mountain range. Major Miller stood at the edge of the hangar, watching as a crane began the process of lifting the ruined airframe onto a flatbed trailer for transport to a salvage yard. There would be no ceremony for Jolly 5-1. There would be no medals that could replace the leg of a pilot or the career of a flight officer. The hangar smelled of hydraulic fluid and the cold, indifferent scent of old metal. The defense headquarters would eventually issue a new assessment, one that would attempt to explain the gap between their predictions and the reality of the electronic trap. But as the heavy steel doors of the hangar began to roll shut, Miller realized that the new brief would be just as fragile as the old one. The technical supremacy they had relied upon was gone, replaced by a new era of warfare, where the silent pulse of a hidden signal was more lethal than 1,000 rounds of lead. The aircraft was a total loss, the crew was broken, and the sky over the border felt more dangerous than it ever had before.